Hello, my name is Netta Byongi and welcome to the Kaplan MCAT Science Review session on language. We'll begin by breaking down language into its components and then delve into the development of language throughout childhood, the influence that language has on cognition, and the areas of the brain that are associated with language. Our learning goal is to identify common linguistic theories, components of language, and impairments that can occur with language. Our learning goal will enable us to answer questions like the following about language theories. Language can be broken down into 5 components. Phonology is the sound of a language. For example, the alphabet, or the letters that compose an alphabet, have various sounds associated with them, or pronunciations. These speech sounds are called phonemes. There are about 40 of these in the English language and many more in other languages, and these speech sounds compose the phonology of a language. The International Phonetic Alphabet, or IPA, transcribes language into its phonemes. So the abbreviation IPA has phonemes denoted by the letters and symbols in the brackets on the screen. Pragmatics is when we place language within its context. Language can change drastically depending on whom we are talking to. For example, we might address a stranger on the street as ma'am or sir, but much more colloquially when we address family or friends. Syntax is how we put our words together to form sentences. For example, saying that Nathan has only 3 pieces of candy has a much different meaning than only Nathan has 3 pieces of candy. So the way we put our words together composes the syntax of a language and can have a strong effect on the meaning of our sentences. Morphology is the structure of words, and the building blocks of words are called morphemes. For example, redesigned has 3 morphemes. Re, which means to do again, design, which is a verb root, and ed, which is denoting that the action has occurred in the past. Semantics is associating meaning with a word. For example, women is associated with mothers, and mothers is associated with women. Now that we've broken language down into its components, let's explore how language develops throughout childhood. Language is essential for interacting with society, and it develops over 5 stages through childhood. At about 9 to 12 months, the child begins the precursor to language, which is called babbling. Babbling is essentially sounds that have no identifiable meaning. At about 12 to 18 months, the child begins to learn 1 word per month and learns to put inflections in those words as well. For example, a child might look at an apple, point at it, and say, "Apple," essentially asking for that apple. At about 18 to 20 months, the child begins a language explosion, which is learning dozens of words and starting to combine those words to create simple sentences or statements. For example, now the child might be pointing at an apple and saying, "Eat apple." At about 2 to 3 years, the child begins to learn longer sentences, usually of 3 words or more, that have more identifiable meanings. For example, the same child might now be pointing at an apple and saying, "I want that apple," a more coherent, identifiable meaning. And at 5 years, the child has mastered the rules of the language. While we only need to understand the basics of language development for test day, it's important to know that this development is a complex process, which begs the question of how we really acquire our language. There are several theories that suggest how the acquisition of language actually occurs. The theories of language acquisition fall on a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum are the biological or natural influences that lead to language acquisition. On the other end of the spectrum are the social or nurture influences that lead to language acquisition. The nativist theory falls on the biological end of this spectrum. This theory is based on the premise that children pick up languages much faster and much easier than would be expected if they were simply learning. Instead, the theory points to the existence of an innate capacity for language, In other words, the tools to learning languages are biologically ingrained in us. On the social end of the spectrum is the learning theory. The learning theory is based on the idea of operant conditioning. This theory posits that all children are capable of learning all languages, but they only learn the language that their parents or environment reinforce. In other words, operant conditioning. In the middle of this spectrum falls the social interactionist theory, which is an interplay between both the biological and social processes that can lead to language acquisition. On the biological side, this theory posits that the brain groups sounds and meanings together. And on the social side, the child interacts with society and the environment and allows certain brain circuits to be reinforced while others die out. Once we learn a language, we can use that language to describe the world around us and to interact with our society. A linguist named Benjamin Whorf took that idea a step further to create the Whorfian hypothesis, otherwise known as the linguistic relativity hypothesis. Whorf claimed that how we think about the world is determined by language. Consider this example of distinguishing color in different languages. In English, these two colors are considered blue, though we might distinguish them by light or dark shades of blue. However, there's still one name for the two shades of the color. In Russian, these two colors have entirely different names. The Whorfian hypothesis suggests that people who speak Russian are better at distinguishing subtleties or differences in the shades of blue, that they have a different perception of the world because of this difference. While it is important to know this hypothesis for the MCAT, it is a rather controversial hypothesis. Studies have shown that language can affect how we think, but it may not be as powerful or influential as Whorfian suggested. While we are not sure to what degree language influences cognition, we do know the areas of the brain that are associated with language. The left hemisphere of the brain contains two regions responsible for speech production and language comprehension. Broca's area controls speech production. Wernicke's area controls language comprehension. The two areas are connected by a bundle of axons that allows for communication and association of the regions. To remember the difference between the role of Broca's area and Wernicke's area, you might consider that Broca's begins with a B, and so does babbling, which is the precursor to speech. So Broca's allows for babbling. Now, you might have noticed that there are other areas of the brain in color in this picture, but don't worry about that. You don't need to know these for the MCAT. They're beyond the scope of this test. Like any part of the body, the brain and the areas controlling language can be impaired. Language impairment is called aphasia. There are three types of aphasia that we should familiarize ourselves with for the MCAT. In Broca's aphasia, or expressive aphasia, patients can comprehend speech but have an impaired ability to produce language. Patients might feel like every word is at the tip of their tongue, but they're unable to express themselves. In Wernicke's aphasia, or receptive aphasia, patients have lost the ability to comprehend speech, but maintain the ability to produce spoken language. Because of the loss of speech comprehension, patients tend to have nonsensical speech. In conduction aphasia, the bundle of axons connecting Broca's area and Wernicke's area is damaged. While speech production and comprehension remain intact, the connection between these two areas is lost. For this reason, patients cannot repeat something that has already been said. Let's see how the MCAT will test the concepts we've learned in this video. Read and answer the practice question. The answer is A. The nativist theory claims that language development is 100% based on biology or nature. So in this situation, people developing a language from square one with no other lingual influences would exemplify the nativist theory. If you had trouble with this question, review the three theories of language acquisition. Let's look at some of the takeaways from this video. The components of language are phonology, pragmatics, syntax, morphology, and semantics. We explored some examples of each of these earlier in the video. There are three theories suggesting how we acquire language and describe language development. Those are the nativist, learning, and interactionist theories. Remember that these fall on a spectrum of biological to social. The Whorfian hypothesis suggests that how we think depends on language. Finally, the areas of the brain that are associated with language are Broca's area, which controls speech, and Wernicke's area, which controls comprehension. Impairment of language is called aphasia. Thank you for joining me in the Kaplan MCAT Science Review video on language. I wish you the very best in your studies.